Earlier this month, I attended a day-long seminar for AP Art History teachers. The presenter noted that students taking the exam are most likely to get low scores in two subject areas. One, medieval art, and two, architecture. And then he added, well, the perfect storm is, of course, a medieval church. I hope you'll consider that a challenge and an opportunity to get ahead of the competition and therefore beat the odds and the curve. That's what the next 6 days is going to be all about. So, what do you need to succeed on those dreaded church architecture questions? Well, first you need to know vocabulary. There's a reason I ran you through a quiz on Basilican church parts twice. All of those terms, nave, transept, aisles, narthex, apse, will remain important in this unit, but we're about to pile on a bunch more terms. I didn't make the rules, guys. Just suck it up and learn this vocabulary. Second, you need to be able to read a floor plan. Floor plans are really a gift. They offer great hints about the right answer to questions. As long as you know what you're seeing, we're going to work on this skill. Third, you need to understand cultural context. These are sacred spaces, right? So they are designed to promote Christian worship. But beyond the specific spiritual aims of Romanesque and Gothic architects are somewhat different. Understand these differences and you're ready to ace a Romanesque or Gothic art essay. Finally, and really this is by far the most important reason to survive this unit and even thrive in it, these churches are among the greatest works of Catholic and Christian art. You are students in a Catholic school. This is part of your heritage. For the rest of your life, when you walk into a great church, you are going to understand what you see. But before I open the church floodgates, let's have a catch-up on some basic European history. We ended our last unit with the demise of the Carolingians, that's Charlemagne, and the rise of the Ottonian Empire of Saxon kings who assumed Charlemagne's old title of Holy Roman Emperor. They would retain that title as Habsburgs for more or less another millennium. Although they weren't known by these names yet, and Germany would not be an independent country until 1866, we're also witnessing the birth of the French and Austrian-German nations. But for a while, things get very tough. If you climb into that time machine, again, I recommend against dialing up 950 to 1050, at least in Europe, unless Muslim Spain turns out to be one of your options. But around the middle of the 11th century, 1050, things look up. In a moment, you're going to see a video introduction to this period that describes two major features of the period, the climax of monasticism and the rise of the pilgrimage. Let me just note that non-art historians are more likely to name population growth as the most important development in this period. So, for example, the population of England is thought to have almost quintupled in the Romanesque era, from around 1 million to 5 million people. So, why did the population explode? Any guesses? Well, one thing is that Europe got a break from the plague. It would come back in the 14th century with a vengeance. The Viking raids slowed way down, and one group of Viking invaders, the Normans, settled in Western Europe and proceeded to multiply fruitfully. In fact, they brought a lot of pretty good government. Iron plows opened up more land for cultivation. Germans settled the Slavic hinterland. And all through Europe, people cleared forests and grew more crops. More food meant more people, a lot more people. Together, these developments began to transform feudalism. At the end of the Roman Empire, urban centers had lost most of their population or disappeared altogether. Now medieval Europeans flocked to towns. For one thing, any serf who could manage to stay in town for a year and a day without getting caught by his lord became a freeman. Money also returned to the economy in this period. People didn't just barter for goods. They used cash. As more town dwellers had cash to build churches, crafts guilds began to compete with monasteries as producers of religious art. And there was simply more religious art that came on the market. Pilgrimage was an important part of our story, so let's turn now to the first part of the video on Romanesque cathedrals. Pay special attention to the role played by relics. Remember how often the College Board will ask you to relate the architecture of sacred spaces to religious beliefs and practices? As we just saw, Romanesque churches were designed to accommodate pilgrimage. But the great Romanesque churches were also, for the most part, monastic abbeys rather than diocesan cathedrals. So you need to know something about monasticism as well. Let's continue with the video. I assume you're taking notes on your notes template. So the first video clip gave you some of the history of the Abbey Church at Vézelay. And I can't resist adding a few more details, since the history of this church really does mirror the history of Christian Europe in this period. So, Vézelay was a site of important mineral springs, and so it was originally occupied by Celtic tribes until it was conquered by the Romans and became the site of a major Roman villa. During the Carolingian period, remember that's Charlemagne, a count established 2 convents here. They were destroyed by Muslim raiders from Spain. The church rebuilt the site, and it was promptly destroyed again by, can you guess? Viking raiders in the early 900s. Sometime during this period, legend has it, a monk somehow obtained some of the bones of Mary Magdalene and brought them to the monastery. In 1037, the beginning of our period, a newly elected abbot, that's the leader of the monastery, decided to cash in on this monastic treasure and upgrade his Basilican church to make it more pilgrim-friendly. You will see the revised floor plan of this church in just a minute, and you have it in your notes. The abbot also asked the Pope for a letter confirming that the relics were valid. The Pope obliged, and Vézelay became a major stop on the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. The new church was dedicated on the 21st of April, 1104, but to add an interesting detail that the video left out, the citizens of the now much more prosperous town got very upset about the high taxes they'd been forced to pay for the church. They revolted and they murdered the abbot. A few years later, a fire broke out in the nave and it roasted to death an estimated 1,200 pilgrims. By the 1120s, the monastery was rebuilding the nave and adding a huge new narthex that was needed to help lodge that throng of pilgrims. The Second Crusade was launched here in 1146 by St. Bernard of Clairvaux, and the Third Crusade, the most successful crusade, the one Richard the Lionhearted fought in, was announced as well here in 1189. Just to carry the story forward beyond the period we're studying in this unit, things fell apart in the 1200s when another body of Mary Magdalene was allegedly found by a different saint in a competing monastery. And the king of Anjou, basically a competing ruler, declared that this was the real relic. By 1537, there were only 15 monks left at Vézelay. When the wars of religion broke out between Catholics and Protestants in the late 1500s, note I'm getting way past the Romanesque period now, past Christmas break, Protestants took refuge in Vézelay and they burned the now discredited relics. There's a story that they played a form of bowling with the heads of decapitated monks. I'm a little skeptical of that one. But at any rate, the church was not destroyed during the French Revolution, unlike the great church at Cluny, probably the greatest Romanesque church of all time. You'll see a model of that in a few minutes. And finally, what goes around comes around. Today, Vézelay is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's a major French tourist attraction. So the good citizens of the town are once again making serious money from a new kind of pilgrim. So let's return now to our video and look more closely at the characteristic of Romanesque pilgrimage churches and how these represented an evolution from the Basilican churches we studied in the last unit. As threatened, here is the floor plan of the Abbey Church of Vézelay, showing how the abbot expanded it from a simple basilican to a Romanesque church. As you watch this next segment, remember about relating the architecture of sacred spaces to religious beliefs and practices. There's a lot of terminology in these units. Before we start examining individual churches, let's quickly review some of the major elements in a Romanesque church. You can label these on your notes template. And then we'll look at a typical Romanesque church plan, similar to the one you just saw in the video. I'm going to talk about Romanesque sculpture in my next lecture, but since elaborately carved doorways or portals are one of the most characteristic features of these churches, and the first thing pilgrims would see upon entering a church, let's start here. You'll see this diagram on your study guide and on a quiz. Your textbook has a labeled diagram on page 463. Don't worry about writing these terms down now. Basically, the stones that make up the arch, not very clearly labeled number 1 here, are voussoirs. You've encountered that term before. The carved moldings around the door, number 5 here, are archivolts. This is the really important one. The semicircular area below the arch and above the door, that lunette-shaped half circle, is the tympanum, often the location of spectacular relief sculpture. We're going to look at these sculptures in more detail in the next lecture. The horizontal beam below the tympanum, number 6 on this drawing, and missing from your study guide, by the way, is a lintel, another term you've encountered before. Remember post and lintel? The vertical post beneath it, between the 2 doors, number 2, is a trumeau. And the elaborately carved posts on either side of the door, not very clearly labeled here as 3, are the jambs. These are shaped like seashells, which was the symbol of St. James. Remember Santiago de Compostela. The extensive use of rounded arches is one of the reasons why art historians labeled this period Romanesque. You will, I hope, recall that arches were a major Roman innovation. Here's another magnificent portal from Arles in southern France. Again, we're going to see more of these in the next lecture. Another prominent Romanesque feature is the use of both barrel and groin vaults. But in Romanesque churches, these are made of masonry or stone, not of concrete. Vaults were beautiful, they were imposing, they didn't catch fire easily, and they created great acoustics for churches that were filled with monks chanting. This model of the central church of the Cluniac order is the best illustration I could find of buttresses, which are basically stone supports that are designed to move some of the weight of the heavy ceiling down and out into the ground, and therefore keep the church from collapsing on the pilgrims. You see 2 kinds of buttresses here. On the bottom are low supporting walls with engaged columns. Those are the columns attached to the walls. On the second level, you see open rectangles. Those are an early form of what are called flying buttresses. Gothic architecture will take this innovation up and out, and we're actually going to talk more about flying buttresses when we get to the next chapter. Many Romanesque churches were abbey churches attached to a monastery, so these covered walkways or cloisters gave monks a peaceful and secluded place to pray. It's hard to see here, but the capitals, remember that's the top of the columns, were often decorated with carved images of saints or biblical figures, one way that Romanesque architecture differed from Roman architecture. Again, I'm going to be talking about Romanesque sculpture in my next lecture. Many Italian Romanesque churches in particular had campaniles, or freestanding bell towers. Note, to the characteristic rounded arches, very Roman. Campanile, by the way, is a favorite College Board vocabulary term. Here you see an arched arcade at the front of the narthex, and also in the atrium or courtyard in front of the church. These 2 were features of Roman architecture that were imitated and refined by Romanesque architects. To hold up those heavy stone vaulted ceilings, Romanesque master builders used very heavy piers. Here at Durham Cathedral, often viewed as the high point of English Romanesque or Norman architecture, we're going to see that in the next lecture, you see both carved rounded piers and compound piers. This diagram gives you more detail about a compound pier. Often narrower columns alternated with compound piers. The compound piers gave strength, the narrower columns were more delicate and beautiful. Okay, that's enough vocabulary for a moment. Let's take a look at some specific churches. Saint-Etienne is a very early Romanesque church. What elements of older Basilican churches do you see? Well, the church still has one of those dangerous timber roofs. Although it's higher and vaulted now, the structure is basically one long rectangular nave. You don't see any interrupting cross structures. The 3-story nave has an arcade on the ground floor, a gallery on the second floor, and a row of clerestory windows to let in light above that. This gets confusing, but because this gallery opens to the aisles, not the nave, it is not technically a tribune, a term we will encounter later. Barrel vaulted piers separate the nave from the aisles of the church, and these are all features that could show up in an earlier Basilican church. But once we look at the floor plan and examine some details from the church, its Romanesque features become more obvious. What do you see from this floor plan? Well, this is actually the first church to be built with an ambulatory behind the apse. This is labeled B here. With radiating chapels extending out from the ambulatory to contain relics or small chapels. So what was the ambulatory used for again? The pilgrims could walk from chapel to chapel, venerating the relics, praying to the relics, and still not interfering with the 8 religious services a day that the monks were required to attend. Note too, you see those historiated or carved capitals on the bottom. The carving on capitals will soon become more detailed and complex. Stay tuned. Saint-Sernin, like Vézelay, was a very important pilgrimage church. And looking at this aerial view, you should see that it was designed for crowds. Note that large multi-story narthex or entryway. See a tower over the crossing. That's the point where the transept meets the nave. And you also see the radiating chapels bumping out from the apse. Okay, now that you've seen the building, it should be easier to understand this floor plan. It's going to be side by side with the earlier floor plan of Saint-Etienne. So what differences do you notice? Well, this church has a transept and double aisles at either side. There are 5 radiating chapels off the apse instead of 3, and 4 more radiating chapels off the transept, room for lots of relics. The circumambulatory aisle around the transept gives pilgrims easier access to the transept's radiating chapels. In other words, this was designed to pack them in. So here's the interior of the same church. Note the barrel-vaulted nave with the massive arched compound piers. And what kind of a ceiling is this again? Barrel vaulted. Sorry, I repeated myself there. Another name for the galleries opening out into the nave is tribune, a Roman term referring to a place where tribunes would speak to the people. The tribunes would hold overflow crowds on feast days, and they also served to give additional support to those heavy barrel vaulted ceilings. The aisles, unlike the nave, are topped with groin vaults, which absorb and distribute weight better than the barrel vaults. The massive compound piers likewise helped bear the weight of the ceiling. Romanesque churches are heavy. They give an impression of extreme solidity. We'll see in the next chapter that Gothic architects figure out ways basically to lighten things up. Okay, now that you've seen several Romanesque churches, take a look at this generic church plan. The narthex in the west front would almost certainly be topped with westworks. You remember what those are? That was an imposing facade with towers. Note that another term for those radiating chapels around the apse is chevet. Usually the AP will use the term radiating chapels. The choir is the space between the transept and the apse, and the altar would be placed in the apse. This area is often a step or two higher than the nave. It's called the choir because traditionally the clergy of the cathedral stood there as a chorus, chanting or singing during the responsive portion of the Mass. What I really want you to notice, though, is the crossing, that deeper green square where the transept intersects the nave. The crossing square, which would be set apart by massive arches. Notice that the circles there are larger. That's a signal in the floor plan that those are thicker piers. And that is the basic geometric unit of the Romanesque church. Each bay of the nave, that is, each section between the piers, would be exactly 1/2 of the crossing square. And you can kind of see that here. Each aisle bay measures exactly 1/4 of the crossing square. Remember that builders lacked our modern day measuring tools, and this geometric organization helped ensure that the building was uniform and symmetrical, and while enabling builders basically to expand their plans and expand their plans and expand their plans by adding more squares. In other words, this is an early and very important form of modular construction. Well, here's another way of looking at a church plan, a vertical section, or what architects call an elevation. In this vertical section, we see a typical aisled church or cathedral with a nave, and in this case, a single aisle on either side. The nave and the aisles are separated by an arcade carried on piers or on columns, so those rounded archways. The roof of the aisle and the outer walls help buttress support the upper walls and vault of the nave. Above the aisle roof, there are a row of windows known as the clerestory, which gave light to the nave. During the Romanesque period, there was a development from this two-stage elevation to a three-stage elevation. When the middle stage between the arcade and the clerestory is a room that opens up to the aisles, it is a gallery or a tribune. When it opens to the nave, it's a tribune. When it opens to the aisles, it's a gallery. When it's blind, that is just fake stone windows like we see here, it's known as a triforium. Is that confusing enough? I wouldn't have included this, but it turns out that the College Board actually asks about these features in some multiple choice questions by name. I will return to this pesky terminology on my test review podcast. So I just talked about generic Romanesque church, but this is really a misnomer because Romanesque art and architecture varied considerably by region. It also varied among religious orders. So the Cistercian monastic movement was in some ways a cousin to iconoclasm. Cistercians were dismayed by the huge sums of money that were spent on these grandiose pilgrimage churches, and they worried that veneration of relics verged on idol worship. Cistercians wanted to return to the traditional monastic ideals, poverty, manual labor, contemplative prayer, and they built churches that reflected the simplicity that they sought to restore to the Christian church. One other note from this slide, while the rounded arch is most characteristic of Romanesque style, some builders experimented with pointed arches, which actually did a better job of distributing the weight of the vaulted ceiling. This is another idea the Gothic architects will run with. Any idea where they might have gotten that idea from? Remember those Islamic arches? A hall church is one in which the aisles are as high as the nave. In most Romanesque churches, the aisle ceilings were lower. This, too, is a term that appears up on AP tests. Barrel vaults made for magnificent ceilings and excellent acoustics, but they were so dangerously heavy it was difficult to incorporate lighting into a barrel vaulted nave. Clerestory windows added light, but they weakened the nave wall, and they increased the odds that the barrel vaulted ceiling would collapse, and as they sometimes did, with considerable loss of life. Covering the nave with groin vaults instead of barrel vaults partly solved this problem. Late Romanesque architects would add ribs to those groins, and that further strengthened the ceiling. Note that, like the Ottonian Church of St. Michael's of Hildesheim, this German cathedral also used an alternate support system. That is, it alternated thinner columns with those thick compound piers. So here's a church from Lombardy or northern Italy. Note the huge arcaded atrium, which shows the areas of strong Roman influence. An open atrium was also more practical when you had a warmer climate, as you did in Italy. Note, too, the double bell towers or campaniles, a common feature in Italian Romanesque churches. The famous Leaning Tower of Pisa, for example, is actually a campanile. Do you notice anything else that's different about this Romanesque floor plan? Well, instead of radiating chapels extending out from the apse, this church has a main apse flanked by two smaller apses that enclosed chapels. And where is the transept? Trick question, there isn't one, as the floor plan should make clear. That's why you need to learn to read these floor plans. Here you get a better view of the ribs added to the groin vaults, both as a strengthening element and as a decorative element. The groin vaults in this ceiling are higher pitched, and an octagonal dome pierced within windows covers the last bay. Again, we're seeing beginnings of a transition toward Gothic architecture and even Renaissance architecture, which you will be pleased to know you're not going to have to worry about until after Christmas break. Despite its steeper groin vaulting, the Italian church is actually not as vertical as the French and German Romanesque churches that we've examined. Italian architects still really admired the early Christian style, and even though they pursued other innovations, in other ways they stayed closer to the traditional Basilican style. The coastal cities of Italy grew much more prosperous during the Romanesque era. They controlled trade with the Byzantine Empire and also trade between the Muslim East and the Christian West, trade that actually, rather ironically, expanded during the era of the Crusades because crusaders acquired a taste for sophisticated Eastern goods. We see that prosperity and also the attachment to Roman and early Christian architecture in this cathedral complex in Pisa. Note that many Italian churches use separate buildings for functions such as baptizing babies and converts. Attachment to the Basilican form notwithstanding, this is still clearly a Romanesque church. And why do I say this? Well, the church has a transept and a crossing square, although in this case, the square is a rectangle and it's covered by a dome. That's what that circular form indicates, a dome. The multiple arcaded galleries also mark it as Romanesque. What Romanesque features does it seem to be missing? No radiating chapels. Italian Romanesque churches were often decorated with incrustation. That simply means bright panels of different colored marble. That's a material, by the way, that was a lot more available in Italy. What Roman building used marble in the same way? The Pantheon. Note, by the way, that this cathedral had a traditional basilican timber roof, not a masonry vaulted roof. We're going to spend a lot of time looking at Renaissance architecture in Florence. This is the city-state's most famous Romanesque building. Baptism played an especially important role socially as well as religiously in northern Italy. So there were elaborate freestanding baptistries attached to with many cathedral complexes. Here again, we see the alternating marble panels or incrustation. Indeed, the architectural style in many ways does echo the Pantheon and also Ravenna's San Vitale, although it does not have a rounded dome. So what is an arcuated panel? It's simpler than it sounds. It just means an arch shaped. In this case, the marble incrustation comes in the form of an arch. So here's another Florence church. Again, note the Italian Romanesque touches. The marble incrustation, some of it arcuated or arch-shaped. There's a diaphragm arch. That's a transverse arch. In other words, an arch that spans the nave and helps support the roof. Although in this case, it's a timber roof, not a masonry vaulted roof. It forms a partial wall dividing a vault or a ceiling into compartments. This creates kind of a rhythmic repetition, and that's more characteristic of Romanesque and Gothic churches than Basilican churches. A lot to keep straight. Try to remember these key elements of Romanesque churches: the accommodation of pilgrims, barrel vaulted and then later groin vaulted ceilings, higher naves with multiple stories, and incredible carvings. That's where we're headed next.